you for coming. This is a little different than our normal format, but we wanted some content. We wanted the ability to educate and at the same time have a lively debate on a new issue that's come across. As the Capital Scotch and Whiskey Club, we're a membership in Olympia, Washington. We're going to push 40 members this month. We've got about half of us attending today. We have with us Mark Guerin and Bradford Knudsen, and they're each representing a role in this debate over Japanese single malt whiskey versus Scotch. And today's heavily edited video will be posted on the meetup.com site once it's been completely edited. And we want you to hold any questions till the end, and we will see questions at the end. And then we'll before the end of the debate, there'll be a tasting, and then there'll be one last question. Okay, so the debate is not over after you vote; it's over after the 13th question. Okay, so I want you to just keep in mind that your vote should be withheld until after the 13th question. Okay, so let's get started. Mark and Brad. Mark first, please describe your background in terms of your passion and understanding of Scotch and whiskey.
Well, I have been collecting the wonderful world of single malts for about 10 years, and I have collected things from just about over 100 different distilleries. Many of them I've actually even tried. And I have ranges from 3-year-olds all the way up to 42-year-olds in my collection. So I have a extensive amount of whiskey, and I've conducted tastings at local places and other things over the years. So, and I enjoy drinking it, so therefore I've studied a lot about it.
Very good. Brad, how about you and Japanese whiskey?
Well, I've been a bartender for seriously for about 12 years, and have studied nationally. Most recently, did a New York 5-day with some of what's considered the premier bartenders in the world. It was a $5,000 scholarship to study spirits and drink making. We tasted 140 spirits in 4 days, and then had 6 hours of testing at the end of it.
And you're still standing.
Yes, it was a taste and spit, although I probably spit out more expensive spirits than I've drank in my life. It was an amazing and wonderful experience. Kind of the peak of my career. I've made drinks for 20,000 people in New Orleans, Tales of the Cocktail, 2 years in a row. So I'm just a spirits aficionado. I'm by no means an expert on whiskey. I got into Japanese whiskey about 5 years ago in New Orleans when the master blender from Suntory was teaching a class, and I just happened to know the brand ambassador, and one of the original 30 people that was going to be taking that class was sick. And so I gave him an elbow and said, I know you've got a seat open. And I was able to take a blending class from the master blender of Suntory. It was the first time in history that 9 individual whiskeys had ever left Japan. And he proceeded to teach us how to make our own blend. And I'll talk a little bit more about that.
When I came to you a little over 2 months ago, there was an article on public radio about the Yamazaki 21. And it scored a 97 and outscored all of the Scottish whiskeys this past year in 2014. Brad, give a history of Japanese single malt whiskey.
And I, again, because I'm not an expert, I'll probably be referencing, as far as history, some of the materials I brought with me.
Translation, he wants to be accurate.
Exactly. Basically, in the early 1900s, Japanese gentleman was studying in Scotland, learning distillation at distilleries in Scotland, and went back to Japan in 1923 and started his own distillery, which is the Suntory Distillery, the oldest distillery in Japan. And 6 years later, in 1929, is when they released their first whiskey, and it's something that's stayed in the family since then. When people ask me why Japanese whiskey is among the best in the world, and I say among, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. But when I was able to take this blending class from the master blender, he had been distilling and blending whiskey in Japan at Suntory for over 30 years. And every single day for lunch for 30 years, the man has the same noodle soup, so that his palate is unchanged in the afternoon when he tastes whiskey. So there's never anything distinguished. And so I always joke that could you imagine a Scotsman eating the same lunch every day for 30 years? And it's just that single-minded dedication to craft, no matter what they do, that the Japanese seem to have that single-minded focus more than anyone else in the world.
Very good. I guess a good context. Mark, can you give us an overview of traditional Scotch?
Well, traditionally, Scotch has 3 requirements. 1, that it's a minimum of 3 years old. 2, it is made of only single malt, which means it's made from the grain of barley. And the third thing is that it comes from the island or the country of Scotland or the region of Scotland. So once you pass those 3 rules, then whatever is produced as a classic whiskey can be called Scotch. Otherwise, it's just a whiskey of some sort. And what's the rest of it? I'm sorry.
Well, it's just an overview of traditional Scotch. How long have they been making Scotch?
A long time. Actually, one of the things that's always funny is reading about Scotch is that they will briefly cover the issue that maybe it was actually originated by the Irish monks and they somehow got to Scotland. So they don't make any claim that Scotland is the home or original site of actually the whiskey making process, but they seem to think that they've been doing it better and longer than most people have. So it's an interesting local pride, but it's been made for quite a while. I don't have the dates with me as far as when most of the distillation has been done. One of the things about Scotland and whiskey production is that being owned and run by the English for so long, there's a long history of Scottish single malt production being done by basically bootleggers in the mountains and the valleys and the hills and the far reaches of Scotland, because the revenuers were trying to stop the production because they weren't getting their tax. And the English tried to control the production of whiskey in Scotland so heavily that the only way that the legal distilleries could in fact keep up with the tax requirements was to create continuous stills that produced a very poor product, but at least produced enough of it that they could actually sell enough of it to pay the taxes. And it wasn't until some of the I'm not sure if it was Queen Victoria, but it wasn't until some of the royal house, which was actually drinking the illegal stuff because A, it was much better and it was very tasty, finally got to the point where they started to release some of the restrictions so that some of the individual distilleries that we know today actually had a chance to start and make it financially viable enough so that they could in fact produce a product that was extremely commercially viable as well as being legal, so that they didn't have to worry about people trying to destroy their operations. In fact, go ahead.
Well, I was going to, while you're on it, you talk about continuous stills. Talk about pot stilling and talk about how the Scottish people have used that and then how that evolved into what they use today or don't use today.
Well, a continuous still is basically a single operation where grain goes in one way and yeast and everything else, and what you get out of the outside end is alcohol. Pot stilling is a little bit more elaborate process where you actually have to go through the process of germinating the barley. The barley is, in order to make any kind of whiskey or any kind of alcohol, you have to have something that yeast can grow on, and yeast grows on sugar. It doesn't grow on starch. So you start off with a barley corn, which is predominantly made of starch. And the only way that you get it to actually change from a starchy product to a sugary product is actually to germinate it. So whenever you've ever had malted milk balls or malted milk is basically maltodextrin, and maltodextrin is a sugar that is created by the process of germinating the barley corn. So what they do is they spray a bunch of brand new little barley corns with water, and they start the process of germination, and at some point, which they figured out how long to do it, you stop the germination so you don't have a bunch of little plants, and that's what's called creating malt. And the malting process is then done by taking a little live plant and subjecting it to 150 degrees Fahrenheit long enough to kill the germination, kill the plant, and you have the basic material then necessary to grind up and to add with water and some yeast to produce alcohol. The alcohol then goes into the liquid, which is very similar to the beer process, goes into the distillation pot still, and when raised to a particular temperature, it produces alcohol like the Moonshiners television show, and you eventually end up with some grain alcohol, and you throw that into a barrel and age it, and suddenly we have what we know as whiskey today. And one of the interesting things about a heads-up competition between Japanese whiskey and Scottish whiskey is the fact that when looking at whiskeys around the world, the classic bourbon is only 4 years old. If you were doing a comparison between bourbon and Scotch, the issue would be is that most traditional Scotches are 12 years old. So being able to compare them for either age or cost or anything else gets to be very difficult simply because of the disparity between the amount of time and processing done as well as the methodologies invoked in order to make them.
Hold on one second. Brad, there's going to be some differences in the Japanese process. Can you tell me what those are? How is the Japanese process?
Well, the Japanese process is going to differ very little, and I'm actually going to interject with something a friend of mine was a national brand ambassador for Suntory for 6 years, and I told him that I was going to be involved in this debate, and he sent me some wonderful information. But the first thing he wanted to iterate is, I mean, we're framing this as a competition, but really, you know, like you've got a really nice Braeburn apple, I've got a nice Granny Smith apple, and we're trying to tell you to tell us which one's better. And so it's really from, you know, just from that basic sense, you know, whiskey's a very personal thing. And I'm just going to read a brief statement from him. He said, his name is Nia White. He was the national brand ambassador for Suntory for 6 years. He says, if I were sitting on that panel, I would deflate the premise immediately. It is a false framing on an implied competition that doesn't exist and not at all useful for the consumer. Your analysis should be the true statement that Japan drinks more single malt than Scotland does and makes more single malt than the U.S. Distillers and marketers of whiskey on all three continents know that they need the other two continents of consumers to make their respective ends meet in a big way. To make them even more tightly bound together, the two leading producers in Japan, you tie up 90% of the Japanese whiskey. They own 6 distilleries in Scotland. Together they employ hundreds of Scots, use 100% Scottish barley from Scottish farms, and pay millions of pounds in taxes in Scotland. I promise you, those people who are actually part of the industry do not see this as an us versus them situation. So there isn't a whole lot of difference. The differences come more in the aging process. And that really is in like the type of oak that is used. The Yamazaki 18, which we're going to have, is actually aged in rare Japanese oak. So it has, so you're going to get completely different flavor structures from that Japanese oak. So with all of that being said, this is still going to be an enjoyable debate, but at the end of the day, we're just going to drink some really good whiskey from both Scotland and Japan, and know that there is a mutually beneficial relationship between the two countries, and there wouldn't be Japanese whiskey without Scotland being the inspiration behind it originally. So
and the roadmap, actually.
Yeah.
We went there, as Mark said, to study it. When you look at the premise, it was brought up by the media and the critics, not the people who make the stuff, and we're entertaining it.
Of course we are.
So you're right. It's a preference item. And there's an actual very good question near the end about this. It's right in line with that. What are the advantages of, Brad, of using Japanese oak or the other kinds of things that might be different? What are they trying to achieve maybe a little differently to establish their niche or their superiority, though? They are competing around the world for the same audience.
Right. I think it's just a uniqueness of brand. You know, by having that one singular difference, that Japanese oak, and they don't use it in all of their whiskey. Like a lot of Scotch using used bourbon barrels. There's plenty of used bourbon barrels. There's plenty of French oak. When we start talking about their blending practices, but I think the rareness and uniqueness of using a strictly Japanese produced product to age their whiskey in is just setting them that little bit apart from the other whiskeys in the world.
You mentioned another cultural difference in that a fellow who's responsible for the blending and the tasting took to one kind of noodle for 30 years to make sure that his palate was consistent. And that kind of discipline, you alluded, may not be as evident in Scotland. Is there another part of the process or another element where that kind of discipline may be in play as well?
That I can't answer. I really don't know. As far as it's like I said, you know, they're bringing in the malted barley from Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's copper still distilled, just like they do in Scotland as well. So as far as like any of the technical parts of that distillation process, I'm unaware of any differences between the two countries. I'm sure there are some. I'm sure, you know, with that single-minded focus, they're very particular about how they do things at every stage.
Would you say that the Japanese whiskey incorporates peating to the same extent?
I would assume so, because I believe from what I've read that they're bringing it in already peated. And you mentioned earlier the peated water.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was before the cameras were on.
Yeah.
But Japan was apparently bringing in peated water from Scotland as part of their experimentation in the whiskey. I do know there was a story I read in one of these about the water in Japan, and when they were first opening up the distillery, and they brought in a master distiller from Scotland, who, when they were first opening up that distillery, said this water is perfect for distilling whiskey, and it, you know, mountain stream, crystal clear water. And
so they're using Japanese water, Japanese oak. They're bringing in some peated water, maybe as possible.
Right, and I don't know where that experimentation has led to, but obviously, with 18 years in the past, this is a purely Japanese
Mm-hmm.
whiskey representation. But again, with the Scottish background and the Scottish products being used to make it happen.
Mark, do you see certain advantages or aspects of Scotland's current methodology compared to what you understand as the Japanese way?
Well, I would assume that the Japanese Suntory is actually using their Scottish distilleries to produce the product for their own operation. If they're importing the peated or the malt coming from Scotland, so that would maintain some consistency between the beginning part of their operation and the operation being done in Scotland by the other distilleries owned by them. So that being said, variations in the process. So the convenient issue is that because they have a fairly consistent environment and majority of it's coming from the same distillery, they have a lot more control over standardization and product control. In the case of Scotland, with at one time 100 different active distilleries, each of the different distilleries has different aged equipment and different types of equipment and different water sources, and in some cases the same people work across the street from two different distilleries, and the product that's produced by the two different distilleries is dramatically different, even though it's the same water source, even though it's the same barley source, and it's the same people doing the operation. So in the case of Scotland, there is a much wider possibilities of range of modifications and differences from the raw product before you even talk about putting it into a different kind of barrel than the barrel you used last week. So the multitudes of variations on a theme from Scotland produce a much wider and much more distributed type of product than the single operation being well controlled and maintained in the Japanese environment. So,
Brad, one of the things I can tell you from my experiences with Japanese is that they focus on singular perfection.
Yes.
And so they may target a certain flavor or a certain aspect and want to perfect it as opposed to broadly experiment. As Mark is alluding, the Scots maybe have more latitude and are more focused on variety as opposed to singular perfection.
Mm-hmm.
When he says that there's more control and standardization, is that?
I wouldn't necessarily say standardization, control for sure. Again, like Nia mentioned, there's 2 distilleries in Japan who are making 90% of Japanese whiskey. But there are many, many different variations, and then when you get into blending, which is a whole nother category, that that they've taken to a different, in a different direction. A lot of, if you talk about Scottish blends, for example, where most blended Scotch whiskey, not vatted malt, but most blended Scotch whiskey, which is something like 80% of the whiskey produced in Scotland is blended Scotch whiskey. Most of it is 30 to 40% whiskey or less, mixed with neutral grain spirits and blended. When the Japanese are doing blending, like this Hibiki 12, the youngest whiskey in the blend is 12 years old, and it's 100% whiskey with different types of barrel aging processes using different barrels. So their blending method is strictly like a vatted malt.
Pure malt, vatted malt.
Pure malt, which is 100% whiskey blending, and again, they're controlling it, where a vatted malt in Scotland might be coming from 20 different distilleries, 20 different whiskeys from 20 different distilleries. They're controlling strictly each one of theirs in their own distillery themselves. So they'll, for example, they'll have a French oak that's 12 years. They'll have a Japanese oak that's 18 years. They'll have a whiskey that's finished in plum wine barrels, so that you can add a touch of sweetness as well to the blend. So it is very particular, but they're trying to create a sense of perfection in their whiskey. So I think just method-wise, that would be the difference between the two.
When you see that there's 90% being controlled by 2 different distilleries, and how many distilleries would represent 90% of Scottish whiskey? I think that makes the point.
Right.
Right.
And so
Probably about 86 different distilleries.
Yeah.
As far as individual locations, and opposed to the actual production, which is predominantly from 2,
Right.
Glenfiddich and Glenlivet.
when we, moving on to a different topic altogether, as a collector, how would I see collecting, Brad, a Japanese single malt? Is it something that can or does appreciate because of it becoming more scarce over time, or are there certain editions that are intended for collectors that you're aware of?
I don't know if it's reached that recognition yet, other than the most recent recognition that it's gotten, being awarded. and I don't know who gave out the award for the Yamazaki 21 year, as the number, as the number one whiskey, which again, relative, opinion based, but,
They got into a fight on the radio. It was fun to watch.
So I don't know if it's reached a level of collectability, because I don't know if the demand has been there. Being a member of the bar community, I've known about Japanese whiskey for 6 years myself, which really isn't that long when you're talking about, an 18-year whiskey. They, and again, also opened up that first distillery in 1923 and released their first whiskey in 1929. So they don't have the history that Scotland does,
So maybe there's potential.
Well, I think knowing right now that I, as someone who knows 2 of the national brand ambassadors in the U.S., and I can't get a bottle of the 21-year Yamazaki, I would think that would be a very collectible bottle right now. So,
Mark, what kind of comments do you have on the collectability of Scotch?
Well, one of the things I think that detracts from the Japanese product being considered a collectible is that they're, unlike the wonderful world of single malts from Scotland, you do have all sorts of variations on a theme. The Balvenie single barrel, for example, that we tried a few minutes ago, has barreling information. It has the number of the barrel. It has the date it was distilled. It has the date it was put into the bottle. It has the number of the bottle that you have in your hand. That makes a product that has, by its own definition, uniqueness. On the other hand, the Japanese product, striving for a consistently available product, ends up becoming a very homogenized product from the perspective of, if you pick up a bottle of it, it should taste virtually identical to the last time you picked up a bottle. And so therefore, without some kind of identification of when this particular bottle was produced, or some kind of special packaging or some kind of special labeling on it that indicates that it's dramatically different or significant from some other bottle from the same distillery, then makes it very difficult to have a unique item that does in fact have its own identity. So, the good news is that you may be able to find 27 different variations on a Glenmorangie world, but you may not be able to find that many from any one of the Japanese distilleries. Doesn't necessarily make it bad or worse, just that there's the possibility of being able to find something special that does have uniqueness in the world of the Scotch whiskeys that you could hunt down and find and try to acquire. So it makes it a lot easier, but there's also a wider range.
Well, maybe they're collectible for different reasons.
Well, collectible because you like it is different than collecting because this particular one release has the notoriety of being one of the smoothest, nicest, tastiest things that you ever had in your life. But it's a different perspective, and neither one of them are dramatically different. I mean, they're dramatically different, but neither one of them is either right or wrong.
Right. Okay. And each of you has a bottle to talk about, and the Yamazaki 18, I'll start with you, Brad. What do you know about that bottle?
Well, I honestly,
And the still.
yeah, no.
And the still.
Well, I honestly don't know a whole lot particular about that bottling. I've not had the opportunity to try it myself, which I'm someone who likes to speak from experience.
We'll catch you on tape after we tape.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to trying it. Like I said, I do know that it is one of the few releases that is using 100% Japanese oak. So I think that's a unique opportunity to pull out some unique different flavors from that. But distillation methods, like I said, I know they're using the copper pot stills, and they look exactly like the stills you would find in Scotland. They were, they were designed with that in mind. They again, with reverence to Scotland, trying to reproduce their own version of a Scottish whiskey.
And Mark, what can you tell us about your selected bottle. It's the, was it a 24-year?
Yes, the bottle I selected is a bottle, again, that actually is from one of the family-owned distilleries in Scotland, as opposed to some of them that are owned by major corporations. So it does fit with the competitiveness of being able to pick something that is family-owned and maintain products from their own production. The bottle that I brought is actually a little older than I was expecting it to be because I forgot, but it's a special Blackadder bottling of something they labeled themselves that comes from a single malt distillery in Scotland, and I'm aware of what the distillery is. But it was originally distilled in 1976 and then bottled in 2000, so it's approximately 26 years old. The price range is effectively virtually the same as the 18-year Yamazaki, so I was looking for something that was competitive either based off of a cost-benefit analysis, but the other thing is that nobody here knows what that particular bottle tastes like, just like the gentleman is not aware of the Japanese flavor profile. So I figured that it was fair to pick something that was going to be the great unknown so that somebody could make a comparison. And of course, the problem with trying to pick something from Scotland is that most people have had a wide range of Scotch whiskies from various distilleries, and most of the distilleries have a very distinctive or similar flavor profile based on their operation. So the problem then becomes, how do you pick something that somebody doesn't go, oh yeah, I've had that before and I know what it is. So that's the reason why I went with the bottle that I went with. No, by the way, that's bottling from cask number 1. So I don't think you're going to find that one out anywhere anytime soon.
And as far as the age difference, I just want to touch on that briefly because a lot of what happens in aging whiskey depends upon where it's aged. In Japan, they have much higher average temperatures over the course of a year than Scotland. So an 18-year Yamazaki could easily be comparable to a 24-year Scottish whiskey. So as far as that age difference, that's not really, it's relative to weather, it's relative to temperature, it's relative to where it's aged and how it's stored and all of that. But temperature definitely being a big factor in how quickly a product ages.
Or in fact, how the actual warehouses where the barrels are maintained are actually, as far as the conditions inside, because a lot of the Scottish whiskies are in fact aged in open air or outside areas that are exposed to cold in wintertime and temperatures in the summertime, and the variations in weather can make a dramatic difference over the course of the life of a whiskey in a barrel. As said, but even if the temperatures are higher in Japan, if they're more consistent and more within a particular range, it would dramatically affect the outcoming product.
Being we've had neither bottle, a couple of the questions I was prepared to ask today aren't going to be relevant until after, okay? So we'll put them after the tasting. The only question, though, that did come up, I wasn't sure if we had any insight on, gentlemen, was whether the Asian palate itself was significantly different than Western European or American palate. I mean, in my travels to Japan, they think that spinach-flavored ice cream tastes good. Or, you know,
right.
Green tea ice cream is what they call it. But so, no offense to my Japanese friends, but that's...
Well, no, and I think there is a basic difference in design from the outset along those lines. The Japanese distillers will tell you themselves that their whiskey is designed to be served with good food. There's supposed to be an overall gastronomic experience along with the whiskey itself. So
you're saying we should have held the debate at a sushi shop?
Maybe. But I mean, that to them, it's part of an overall experience that they are contributing to, and so it's not just whiskey for whiskey's sake. It's whiskey for the sake of an overall greater experience.
That's a very good insight, Brad. Mark, do you have any ideas as to the Japanese palate, off chance? Or?
Well, the Oriental palate is dramatically different than other regions simply by looking at what production and what sales of various especially blended scotches. For example, Chivas Regal is very popular in the People's Republic of China. There's another vatted malt called Matisse, which is very popular in the Asian area that you rarely, if ever, see in the United States. So different product lines selling differently in different geographical areas would indicate that the population has a different flavor profile.
Richard, we're going to stop here. We're going to do our tasting, and we'll have a few other questions on tape afterward. We're back with a couple more questions after our tasting, and then we'll go to a vote and announce that on film as well. But before we go on about the two bottles in question that are, single malt whiskeys, an interesting conversation happened off tape about the process of blending in Japan as compared to Scotland. I want to follow up on that. Brad, you pointed out that the blending process in Japan involved more of a vertical, where you weren't really dealing with multiple distilleries contributing to the blend.
Right.
Can you go into that?
Well, and I'll actually, because after we discussed it, I noticed something really good, but I'm not going to read it directly out of here, but they mentioned it's knife-to-throat competition amongst the three major distilleries in Japan. So unlike Scotland, where when you're blending whiskeys from many different distilleries, the heated competition in Japan amongst the few distilleries that are making whiskey is such that there is no cooperative effort amongst those individual distilleries. So they are working within their own means to create these blends, and we touched on, there's different types of blending. The type of blending that they're doing in Japan is just blending actual whiskey together. They're not bringing in a neutral grain spirit. They're not flavoring it. They're not doing anything like that. So what they're doing is they're taking different ages, different barrels, different fermentation methods, different yeast strains, and using all of those to try and create a really nice whiskey. And so this leads into my experience in New Orleans, taking the blending class, which I alluded to earlier, where I learned from the master blender who had been blending for 30 years in Japan. And you see the lab coat there. Couple of funny things about that is there were only 30 of us in the class, and I, like I said, weaseled my way into it. And he brought us all lab coats that they wear at the distillery in Japan, but the largest was a medium. And me and another friend of mine, Rocky from Seattle, not small men, it's like a short sleeve shirt on us, and really tight. So I'm not going to demonstrate the small fit, but the other thing that happened, I mentioned earlier that the single-minded dedication and having the same noodle soup every day for lunch for 30 years. He didn't speak a word of English, had an interpreter, and they talked together. And he went through his process of blending and what he looks for, and but right before we got finished and we're going to make our own blend of these 9 individual whiskeys that had never left Japan before, the American brand ambassador brought out that same noodle soup that he had eaten every day for 30 years for us to taste before we tasted all the 9 individual whiskeys and made our own blend with it. And so one of what I brought with me was his Hibiki 12, which is his blend of different whiskeys. The youngest being 12 years old, up to 30 year. There was a 30-year blend in there as well. And then the last few little drops of my one-of-a-kind individual blend of Japanese whiskey and his signature on the bottle that he signed for me. So I was going to pass these around in a little bit and let you smell them, not taste them, because there's only a taste left in this one. But just to get an idea of what the blending process is versus just, trying to go for an individual single malt style, Scottish style whiskey.
Before we go on to the two bottles that we're going to argue the single malt, can you give us a brief overview of the Scottish blend, Mark?
Well, yeah, and the reason why I thought it was poignant to bring up in this conversation, because when you're talking about Scotch and you're talking about a blend, traditionally that implies that it is different single malts from different distilleries. And if you put those together without grain whiskey, you get what's called a vatted or a pure malt. Good examples are the green label Johnny Walker, another one called Matisse, which are nothing but the individual flavors. And I tell people about single malts that the single malts to me are the individual spices of which foods are made from. And when you make a single malt, you make a single type flavor profile. And when you start adding them together and mixing them, and quite often in Scotland, major blends actually include ingredients that are not even owned or controlled by the major owner of the blend itself. So there's a lot of trading that goes back and forth between the various companies that are producing single malts so that they can guarantee their competitors have a consistent product for their own operations, which is dramatically different than the Japanese. But their perspective is different things being blended together from the same distillery, while in Scotland, a blend implies things from different distilleries. So there's a dramatic difference. So when you look at the Japanese whiskey, don't disdain from it because if it has the word blended on it, simply because it's a different perspective and different product.
All right, folks, now we're going to get to the two bottles we've tasted. Brad, when you think of the Yamazaki that you've tasted and you were going to describe the flavor profile, what to look for to somebody who's never really tasted Japanese whiskey, how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, much of what I'm going to say was our conversation here when we were tasting it together. But there's definitely like an orange citrus aspect to it. It was surprisingly peaty, which I'm sure is coming from the importation of the peated barley from Scotland. And I described almost a waxiness, and you and I have had this discussion of chill filtered versus unchill filtered whiskeys, which I don't think this is, but it had the reminiscence of that, and I was wondering if that came from that Japanese oak being the little difference in texture, as well as flavor. A little bit of pepperiness, but not overpowering, and the toffee and caramel, which definitely, to me, made it a really nice, smooth finish on the whiskey itself.
And Mark, when we look at the bottle that you're representing, what kinds of things would you look for and coach a novice Scotch drinker to look for?
Well, honestly, I actually thought that the two different whiskeys had a very similar flavor profile, and I think the major difference is that the higher alcohol content in the one that I brought produces a little bit hotter flavor in the mouth. But other than having a little bit less of the citrusy orange peel to it, I thought that they were very similar. They're similar based. In fact, the interesting thing is the color is almost exactly spot on, which I thought was also amazing as well. So very similar flavor profiles. They both have a little bit of peat to them. They both have, in the case of the Glenfarclas Blairfindie, it actually has a lot of the cut from the peatiness based off of the sherry casking that was done, which I think is an interesting combination of the two, which makes it a much more palatable beverage to my own liking. But again, you get a lot of the same flavors in the mouth, just a little hotter because of the little slightly higher alcohol content.
Okay, and Mark, if you were going to argue in favor of the Yamazaki, if you preferred it, what would you be accenting in that description.
Well, the key difference between the two bottles that we tasted today is that the Yamazaki 18, if you were to be able to find it and get it available to you, the odds are it'd be a fairly consistent product from one year to the next. Much like the people that look for the Johnnie Walker Blue Label or the Johnnie Walker Red or the Black, they're looking for something that, when blended together, comes out fairly consistently. The advantage on the wonderful world of single malts from Scotland is the fact that there are so many different variations on a theme. However, from one year to the next, they can be dramatically different. And because of that, it doesn't lend itself as well to being able to guarantee that the product that you try this year with the same labeling is the same product you see the next year. So as far as having some degree of reliability, even if the availability is kind of tight, I would say that if you like the Yamazaki, you'd be pretty much assured that the product would be fairly consistent.
And Brad, if you were going to argue for the Glen Parkless expression, what would you say stood out?
Well, to me, again, an excellent representation of a Scottish whiskey. And we talked about the regions, the Speyside. This was leaning more towards Highland, being a Speyside. I refer to Speysides as the bourbon of whiskey because they tend to be sweeter and less peaty and less smoky. But this had some really nice smoky and peaty hints without being overwhelming in that aspect. So I really enjoyed that, and but still able to pull out the underlying complexity of the Scotch itself. I would say if you were able to get your hands on this bottle, I mean, this was a very unique experience for us, and and we were lucky to have an individual bottle like this, which is the advantage of that. We today had an experience that we probably won't ever have again, so that's the advantage there.
Folks, we're going to have the word clouds that we do with our tasting notes on the meetup.com website. In addition to that, you'll see the vote, per se, as to all of us in our enormous attendance here, expressing a preference for one over the other. Bottom line, get involved with CSAW, Capital Scotch and Whiskey. Our normal format is one Sunday every month at 5:30, and we'll let you know. Thanks a bunch for watching our film and joining our organization.
And I'm voting for both.
So we've got these tasting